Well, all right. It is 1:30 here in Des Moines. It is 2:30 for those of you on the East Coast, which is the time we have. Sorry, I just slipped into Central Time as I'm want to do. I just wanted to get us started here right on time. We know folks will be coming in, and that's just fine. We're glad to have as many people here as possible. My name is Andrew Klump, and I am the editor of the Annals of Iowa, which is published by the State Historical Society of Iowa here in Des Moines. I work here at the state, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this conversation today. Iowa is turning 175 this year. It's a very big deal for us. We're very excited about it. And it's also been a great opportunity for us to gather historians to think together about what 175 years of Iowa history, 175 years and longer has been. And so this panel today is a panel discussing various aspects of Iowa history, but it's also a panel that helps us put together many of the subfields and ideas and conversations that we have throughout this conference in a way that's brought together by a state, I guess you could say. So in this panel, Iowa brings us together, but we're going to be hearing from scholars who work on gender, who work on race, who work on the Civil War, who work on Native and white interactions before statehood. There's a variety of different perspectives that are going to be coming together today. And I hope that that is a really rich conversation, because a space is bringing these folks together who come at their work with really dynamic and interesting perspectives. And so I'm really delighted to have you here today. The way that we'll have this panel move forward, it's a roundtable. So we have a series of questions that we've circulated with the panel ahead of time. I will pose a question, and then everyone on the panel will have a chance to chime in with some thoughts, and we'll move forward that way. We'll spend about half the time, maybe 45 minutes to an hour, on those questions, and then we're going to open it up to the Q&A from our group here. There's been a variety of ways that that's worked out in the conference so far. What I'd encourage you to do is to either raise your hand or put your question in the chat box. Either of those are fine. I'll be monitoring that. And as best as I'm able, I'll try to go by first come, first serve. So if I see your hand up, I'll make a little note in my notebook here that lets me keep track of who to call on first, and I'll give you a chance to do that. But that's how I'd like to go about it, just to try to make sure that everyone is heard. But if I miss anything, just send me a quick note and I'll make that happen. But we'll give that a try. With that said, I think we'll just jump into introducing our panelists, and we'll start our conversation. I'm really looking forward to it today. And I'll introduce our panelists in alphabetical order by last name. And that's the order we'll kind of kick things off. First is Dwayne Coleman. Dwayne is a PhD candidate at the University of Iowa and the co-director of the Iowa Colored Conventions Project. Dwayne's research focuses on African-American communities, African-American veterans of the Civil War in kind of the latter half of the 19th century, among a variety of other things. He was on a great panel earlier this year at AHA that focused on some different themes. So he does a lot of really interesting research. Today he'll be focusing kind of on the Civil War Reconstruction era, how we've talked about that in Iowa history. Sarah Egge is, Dr. Sarah Egge is the Claude D. Pottinger Professor of History at Center College. Her research has focused on gender and citizenship in Iowa. You have already heard from her multiple times today. She's the president of the Midwestern History Association. And she also has, her book has focused on gender and citizenship and voting and women's suffrage in the Midwest, with a particular focus on Iowa, among other states. Well, our third panelist is Dr. Ashley Howard. She's an assistant professor at the University of Iowa. Her research focuses on African Americans in the Midwest, as well as violence, and her manuscript is focused on violence against African Americans in the 1960s, so the 20th century in particular, which is great because we have a whole chronological range in this panel as well, from before statehood all the way to the 20th century. And our final panelist today is Dr. Patrick Young. He is a professor of history at the Milwaukee School of Engineering. His research focuses on Indigenous and white interactions in the contact era, which for those of us who don't work in the earlier periods is essentially the pre-statehood era for Iowa. So that's the early 19th century and earlier even than that. So he will be discussing with that. It's really exciting for me to have this conversation because of all the ways that our previous plenary, which was excellent earlier, overlaps with so much of what we about today. There was references to the Blackhawk War. Dr. Young has written extensively about the Blackhawk War. You heard from Dr. Howard in our plenary, also discussing African Americans in Iowa. And it's just really wonderful to see the many ways that our conversation in the plenary will hopefully inform our conversation here with so many of the strengths of our panelists. And with that, that is plenty from me. Each of these folks will talk about kind of questions from their own perspective, but I hope it'll be a really rich and vibrant conversation. And we look forward to hearing from them and hearing from you as the questions come up. So the first question that I want to pose to our panelists, and this is a great way to introduce yourselves and your topics, but also to get us thinking, is just to ask the question of what major themes, ideas, or subjects have traditionally motivated the study of your particular area in Iowa history. So that is to say, what have been the dominant narratives, themes, people, places that have informed people who want to study your particular focus? And we'll talk later about whether you think those are on the right track or where they should go. But let's get the lay of the land before we jump in. And we'll start with Dwayne.
Thank you, Andrew. It's great to see all of you. I'm glad to see so many faces and definitely recognize a number of you. So it's good to see you. Just to let you know, I'm noticing a little bit of hesitancy in my video, so hopefully I don't cut out here too much or at all. So yeah, in answer to the question, you know, I think about my own experience. I'm originally from Las Vegas, so I'm not from Iowa or the Midwest. My wife is from the Midwest, but in coming to Iowa, one of the questions I had when I got here is thinking about Black history. I wanted to know more about Black people and their history here in Iowa, and so I began to research that. I began to look at, I go to some presentations that the State Historical Society here in Iowa were putting on at that time. And as I looked into more about the history, Black history of Iowa, I found out there was an amazing and rich history in that I could learn a lot from. That being said, there was a lot there weren't a whole lot of articles or books written on the subject, though. And so while the history exists, there was a lot of searching that I had to do in order to find that history. And you know, as I was going to presentations and doing research and talking to various people, I found that really fascinating. Some of the really fascinating stories that I was coming across were about early freedom seekers who came through Iowa. Iowa had a very active underground railroad, and I wasn't aware of that at all. I'd never heard of that. And also that some of those individuals who came here to Iowa seeking freedom also enlisted in Iowa's all-Black regiment, the first Iowa Regiment of African descent during the Civil War. And I thought, I didn't know about that either. I thought that was really fascinating and wanted to know more about these individuals. And I also wanted to know more about what happened to these individuals and their families after the war. And so those were the kind of interests that that's kind of what interested me and brought me to the subject, things that I'm researching right now about African Americans and community formation in Iowa. And you know, with that, there's some great articles that have been written on the subject of African Americans in Iowa and in the Civil War, one by David Brodnax, who I see is here. And also my advisor at the University of Iowa, Leslie Schwam, has written a lot on it with her book, Emancipation's Diaspora. But the history of African Americans in Iowa hasn't always been, you know, hasn't always been a focus, hasn't always been taught. And so with that, there's tons of research to do right now as it pertains to African Americans in Iowa. And I'm sure that's the case elsewhere throughout the Midwest here too. And that's exciting. That's exciting to be a part of that, to be able to look at this fascinating research and to also help to reimagine the region and and the amazing stories and amazing history that African Americans and other minorities were a part of.
Fabulous. That's great. Great place to start. So we'll move on to Dr. Eggy.
Great. Well, thank you to all of you who are here today. Thank you to Dr. Klump for putting this panel together, and I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you, Dwayne, for your comments to kick us off. So I come to the history of Iowa through the lens of gender and women's history. I was interested in it as an undergraduate when I first took a women's history class when I was, 19, and I learned about the women's suffrage movement. And I thought it was really fascinating, but I was like, where are the Midwestern women? Where are all these people that I know were advocates for women's rights and equal rights? And so that's what got me interested in thinking about women's history broadly, and then specifically in the Midwest and looking at gender. So kind of the traditional, to answer the question, the traditional lens has often been looking at sort of this binary. Were Midwestern women oppressed by the patriarchal system, or were they resisting? To what extent did they actively seek equal rights? And so there's sort of these two competing narratives. And so I think for me, that was my entry point into thinking carefully about this. What I didn't realize is, as Andrew pointed out, I actually got really interested in the history of citizenship, because that was a main way for these Midwestern women to frame their claims to the ballot. And it also definitely intersected with the rise in nativism or anti-immigrant sentiment, which was very profound in the Midwest and in Iowa in particular. And so for me, that really led to not just a question about gender, but also a question about the intersection of things like ethnicity and race in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so that framing then I think has been challenged, which I'm happy to speak about in other questions, but not just this binary of oppression versus resistance, but how do we complicate that idea even more and understand how people in local communities in Iowa shaped their own gender identities. So that's my entry point, and I think there's a lot of thematic similarities that I'm starting to see, and I look forward to talking about that more.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, we're on the second panelist. I'm already really excited about the things I'm overseeing. So let's move on to Dr. Howard. Yeah.
Well, again, I'll echo the first two panelists and say thank you very much for this invitation. It's wonderful. So I will begin with a confession. I'm not a native Iowan. I am a native Nebraskan. And if you know anything about Iowa and Nebraska, that is blasphemy. In fact, when I took this lovely job at a fantastic institution, my parents asked me if I was sure if I really wanted to be a Hawkeye. And you see I'm wearing a shirt from Ray Gun, which is a great company here, that says, yes, there are Black people in Iowa. And I love Ray Gun, but I do take a little bit of offense because they have a wonderful map of the Midwest. And there is an arrow pointing to Nebraska that says, I'm with stupid. So there is a big tension between Iowa and Nebraska, which I'm still trying to work through. Now, a dear friend of mine once said that all research is me search, right? And so I came to Midwestern Black history and Iowa Black history very much through my own experiences. I went to Chicago from Omaha for college. And that first year, first of all, everybody was shocked that there were Black people in Omaha. And I was like, there's actually a lot of us. You may have heard of Malcolm X. And that was the first year of One Book, One Chicago. And Mayor Daley chose Willa Cather's My Antonia. And if you're familiar with Willa Cather's work, it does not present, shall we say, the rosiest picture of the Midwest. Inevitably, someone suffers a tragic accident. Oftentimes someone engages in self-harm, and everybody's like, is what life is like in the Midwest? First, there's no Black folks, and then all of this. I was like, no, actually, it's a pretty interesting place. It's pretty deep and more complicated than Willa Cather or just, flat, literal and figurative whiteness. And so that is kind of how I began to look at this project. But as I got into looking at the Midwest and the Black experience, I was in a master's course, and I asked my parents, my father, a Black man who grew up in Omaha, and my mother, a white woman who grew up in rural Nebraska, what should I study? And they mentioned the urban rebellions. the riots, right? These uprisings in the 1960s, which I now have to, qualify given the past couple of years. And both of them had very different memories of these events. And I realized that due to their intersectional identities, right, the race, their class, where in the region they're from, they understood these moments of history in very distinct ways. And it blew my mind that someplace like Omaha, right, which was supposed to have none of the big issues of cities like Newark and Detroit and LA, had uprisings as well. And so this is how I began to parse it out. And how Iowa comes into play, which I never would have imagined had I not got into this, is because of the relatively small numbers of Black people in Midwestern urban communities. There is a lot of, I make a triangle, but there was a lot of interaction with these people, right? So the youth council of the NAACP is hanging out with kids in Minneapolis. They're hanging out with kids in Wichita. The Black Panther Party, Omaha, Kansas City, and Des Moines all are working together and think of themselves as kind of a collective unit, distinct from the coast and needing one another. And so this is very much done in conversation. And while this idea of kind of contagion in the urban rebellions has largely been debunked and defunct, Des Moines had an uprising the weekend before Omaha's uprising in 1966, right? So this is very much part of the political consciousness and the understanding of what's going on. And so for me, my research is very much animated that Black people in the Midwest are aware of not only what's going on in their own communities and the nation, but have an acute sense of what is going on regionally as well.
Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah, I'm like jotting notes feverishly over here. But this idea of connection, right, in small places, I'm super interested. I will have questions. We'll move on to Dr. Young, though, on this first question.
Well, can you hear me all right, Andrew? Okay, so I want to make sure I did unmute. Thank you again, Andrew, for putting this panel together. I'm very honored to be part of it. I'm dealing with the contact era, which essentially opens when the French enter the region in 1673. And the short piece that I'm writing for the roundtable, I've decided to call it Iowa Without Borders, because I think in the pre-contact era we really have to not look at not just Iowa but any Midwestern state. We really have to dissolve the borders, because when Marquette enters the Mississippi in 1673, of course there were no borders. And there were no Wisconsin borders, Minnesota borders. Those borders just didn't exist. There were borders that Native people drew, of course, but those were very different than the borders that later, settler colonialism would bring about. The other thing, the contact era, we also have to dissolve some temporal boundaries because, of course, we have documentation that shows us when the French enter the region. But of course, there were 11,000 years of Iowa history before that with the Native people who lived there. And of course, prehistory is usually the realm of archaeologists. History is the realm of historians. There's a growing consciousness among both that we shouldn't let those temporal boundaries, put us in silos. We should look for continuities. We still have to look at change. The entry of the French into the region certainly opens up a new chapter, not just for the Native people, but also for the French. So when we look at the contact era, which is essentially, if we want to have some, flexible temporal boundaries, 1673 to 1846 with Iowa statehood, that's 173 years. And of course, Indian-white relations, between Native people and the various imperial powers. And you really have 4 different imperial powers that will have a stake, not just in Iowa, but in the larger Midwest. Again, I like to think of this, Iowa as being an integral part of this region, even well after statehood. Now, a couple things that make Iowa unique is it was basically devoid of French settlements during the contact period. You had Green Bay and Prairie du Chien in Wisconsin. You had the Illinois country, of course, in southern Illinois, Vincennes in Indiana. Iowa's a really late comer because you don't really have the first permanent French presence until Julian Dubuque receives a grant from, and he doesn't even receive it from the French because by that time, the Spanish, Iowa is part of Upper Louisiana in 1796. So in many ways, Iowa was a latecomer to the whole imperial period. I'll talk more about some of the historiographic shifts that we've seen in the last probably 3 decades that I think future Iowa historians need to be well aware of when they look at the pre-contact period. But I just, while it's on my mind, I have to give Eric McDuffie a shout out for mentioning the Blackhawk War during the plenary session. And he was spot on. This was an event that brought settler colonialism to Iowa with a vengeance. So for now, I just kind of want to set the stage for some of the later questions. There have been some really significant historiographic trends in the last 3 decades. And I still think there's a lot of research that can be done on this era between the beginning of contact between Indians, between Native people and Europeans, and Iowa statehood in 1846. And future Iowa historians really need to keep some of those new trends in mind. So thank you.
Fabulous. Yeah, that's what a great first round. I'm already thinking about the connections, right? This idea of dissolving borders and boundaries and connections in ways like, who would have thought, like, we're connecting the contact era all the way to the 1960s, right? Where people are moving beyond boundaries, and that's essential to who we are in Iowa. And I've, Sarah, your book, Dwayne, your work, all has these kind of themes. I'm very excited, as you can tell. But let's move right on to our next question. This is really wonderful stuff. So the question I have is kind of a snapshot, right? How would you describe the state of the field, if you will, with regard to the current research in Iowa history? And that's in your own area, right? So if you had to give a snapshot of like what's happening in Iowa history right now in the particular area you're thinking about for this panel, what would you say? And I think in some ways that'll help us also think about the Midwest, right? We're at the Midwestern History Conference. So I don't think Iowa is an outlier, but for the sake of discussing something more discrete, what's going on in Iowa history right now in your area? And we'll start with Sarah, Sarah this time.
You can call me Sarah. That's just.
I know I know all of you, and I normally refer to you by your first names. I'm trying so hard to be formal, but
no, it's fine. Okay, so the state of the field in terms of gender in women's history, I think it is growing and it continues to grow. One of the things that when I started to think, saying that there was really no history in the women's suffrage movement, at least about women in the Midwest, is that we're still kind of doing the work. We're creating the narratives at this point. So whether it's my book on women's suffrage, I think of Jenny Barker Debine's book on agrarian feminism, which looks at women's role in agricultural groups in the mid 20th century. There's a lot of good work that's been done in the past a few years, to really try to uncover this history. And then sort of taking what was a marginalized group, women and their voices and their work, and putting them at the center and realizing that actually women had a profound role. They played just a dramatic role in the creation of Iowa as a state, even before the state existed. And so making that clear, there's been a lot of great scholarship in terms of women's labor, both in terms of their agricultural work, and then also with the rise of industries, factories, mining, looking at women in those places, looking at more urban spaces. There's been really great interventions. I just wrote a paper on women in Iowa foodways and politics, and how women were using cookbooks and recipes to try to gain political recognition at a time when there were still lots of ideas about traditional women's roles in the home. So there's a lot of these kind of interventions of trying to change the narratives and bringing women to the forefront. And so I think that's really helpful. And I think there's other things that continue, looking not just at women, but gender broadly, sexuality. There have been some early studies. I know people are doing work right now on this. So I'm thinking of a book, I know her, I can see her face, but she wrote a paper on, or a book on prostitution in Des Moines. And it was really wonderful because it's this kind of unknown or less well-known aspect of settlement houses in Des Moines and how prostitution was quite open for a lot of years. So I think that's something that we're starting to continue to see, complexitization of this kind of history. And I know you have a question of what's missing, so I don't want to get too ahead of myself. But I do want to say, I know there is work under uncovering LGBTQ history in Iowa, although I know that we are nowhere near where it needs to be. So I'll say more about that later, but I just want to say that I know that scholars are getting into that, and I think that's really important too.
Wonderful. And you're thinking of Sharon Wood's book? Is that?
That's one. Yeah, she does. I don't remember the name of it. Her name is, well, I went to Iowa State with her, so this is why it's really embarrassing that I can't remember her name. I'll say it.
Or you can drop it in the chat. Like
I will. Yes.
The beauty of the chat.
That's true. That's right.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Howard.
I'm glad we mentioned the beauty of the chat, because I certainly am going to forget someone's name too. So I need that phone a friend option as well. So when I think about the state of the field, something that very much informs the way I teach Black history and the way I think about Black historiography is an old article that Vincent Harding wrote in the 70s called History, White, Negro, Black. This is one of these names I had to look up before we got on this call. And I think it's such an important article because he talks about how Black history is written about. So, there's white history, which is this kind of triumphalist narrative. We had this problem and then we fix it, and we're just kind of marching through, getting better and better at every era. Harding calls Negro history just the insertion of Black actors into that overwhelming narrative. What I often joke with my students is chocolate dipping history, right? It's the same narrative of, settler colonialism, of the Revolutionary War, but we're just inserting Black actors into that. And what Harding is arguing for is a Black history which challenges the fundamental understanding and framing of American accounts. And so I think about that when I talk about the state of the field in terms of Black Iowa history. As Sarah said, there is a lot of recovery that still needs to be done. But so much of the Black history that has been done on the state has fit into these triumphalist narrative, right? We used to be racist, but now we're not. Or, Missouri was racist AF, as the kids say, right? Like Missouri was really bad, but Iowa, like we're a bright shining light, to evoke a particular book title, that we're not as bad as some of the other places when we think about Midwestern racism. And so it's still very much kind of picking up these trends of recovering, just inserting Black voices into a narrative we already know, and patting ourselves on the back for not being as bad as other places. And so I really think the state of the field is beginning to move, right? It's beginning to shift a bit, decentering these traditional accounts, beginning to really root ourselves in African-American studies traditions to think critically about these stories from the perspective of Black actors. But we do have a long way to go. And I think there are some people who are doing really exciting work on this. So of course, our brilliant graduate student, Dwayne, who's on the panel here, is one of those people. I think of new books out by Annalisa Cox is one. He's not writing on Iowa specifically, although Iowa does factor into it, but I also think about Brett Campney's work. His most recent book, Hostile Heartland, really calls the Midwest and places like Iowa out, that, we want to put anti-Black violence as a Southern phenomenon, but in fact, it is the very fabric of which the Midwest was built. So I think we're heading in that direction, but by and large, those studies are still being written and those stories are yet to be uncovered.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and a terrific framework, right, to think through. That's wonderful. Thank you. Dwayne, you go. You're up. Oh no, sorry, Dr. Young. Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah,
I'm unmuted, so I didn't want to miss my turn here.
No,
It's
you
okay.
didn't. That's on me.
That's okay. Well, let me talk about, as I say, the current state of the field. I'd like to start out with the book. It came out in 1991. It was by historian Richard White. It's called The Middle Ground, and it was really seismic in its influence. It's often said that the book The Middle Ground really revitalized Midwestern history, and I'm sure there's a few people at the conference who would echo me on that. It really kind of rescued Midwestern history from being sort of this parochial branch of history, and it put it back center stage into the national historical narrative. It also it completely revolutionized historians' understandings of Indian-white relations in the Midwest, because the imperial powers became quite a bit less imperial. In a nutshell, what Richard White's argument was that the imperial powers had to recognize a lot of native power. They didn't exact nearly as much hegemony as we want to think. And the argument in the middle ground was that, there was a middle ground, that, both native people and imperial powers exercised relatively, even amounts of power. Well, in the last 15 years, there's been a whole new, sort of revision of White, and people like Catherine Duvall, Michael Witkin, Michael McDonnell, they say, no, the Midwest was a native ground. The native people, the indigenous people, dictated to the imperial powers the nature of the relationship. And I know, White certainly influenced my doctoral research and my work on the Blackhawk War. And now, the more I think about it, you can find so many instances in the archival documents where the imperial powers have no choice but to bend to the will of the native societies that live in the Midwest. So that's, the idea of the native ground. I would tell any young historian who's going to be doing work on Indian-white relations in Iowa or any place else in the Midwest, you've got to start with that paradigm. And the one thing I'd like to also point out, and one of the reasons I think, and I guess I'm a pretty good example of why this has been such a seismic shift historiographically. And I'm probably more at the age. I mean, I was born in 1963, and believe it or not, I wasn't old enough to really get involved in a lot of the big historical debates in the 1960s, but that's when this all begins. But I know, if I would have looked at a history book, say, when I was 10 years old, that showed the French Empire in North America, it would have shaded everything in from, the Gulf of St. Lawrence all the way to the Missouri River and all the way down to Louisiana. And of course, if you just think about how powerful that can be iconographically, you think, well, gee, France must have controlled this entire big, huge bite of North America. If you want to redraw that map, think of it like this: shade in everything from Quebec to Montreal. That's what France actually controlled. Everything else west of there and south of there, native people really called the shots. And one of the things that was really kind of going through my mind as I was getting ready for the panel, we really need to start redrawing maps during this period, and showing, who really had the bulk of economic, social, cultural, political power. And we have to start shading, central Iowa as being the home of the Iowa Indians, of course, also the Dakotas. We need to sort of shade those parts of Iowa where they were the real possessors of political, economic, and social power. The French, who managed to get in there to trade, maybe have a campaign or two, well, they were interlopers at best. So this idea of the native ground, I think, that's really been a powerful shift in understanding Indian-white relations in the Midwest. And I think it's got to be something that's got to be central to future work on Iowa history in the coming decades. So that's it.
Perfect. No, it's great. It's really interesting to hear about these paradigms, right? There's lots of, they're distinct, but they're also kind of moving in similar directions within these fields. So now to Mr. Coleman, you are up.
Thank you. I agree with everything that everyone shared so far. Some great, amazing things, as we can see in what everyone said, is happening right now. A couple of things that I would add is that some things that I see happening is that there is a number of historians are working on a work that it's trying to place the Midwest back into the national narrative, and especially when we're talking about the Civil War era, issues of the participation of abolitionists in Iowa and the Underground Railroad here, and in helping freedom seekers. That hasn't always been a part of the wider national narrative about the free soil movement and the abolitionist movement. And Iowa played a huge role in the westward expansion during this time period. And they, of course, had a lot to gain as a result of the expansion west. And so that's an important narrative that is being resurrected, I guess you would say, and placing Iowa back into this this history. I don't think that its place has been as well as it should be. And with that, of course, as Ashley mentioned about white triumphalism, Black people have almost completely been taken out of that narrative, and that's work that's definitely being done to reinstate the place of Black people in the Midwest, and how they helped to transform the Midwest. During the Civil War, there was a huge migration of Black people from the South into the Midwest. And that, of course, had consequences. And those consequences helped to shape and change what we see as Iowa and other states in the Midwest, right? The expansion of rights, how do communities deal with these changing demographics? How were Black laws that were in effect in many states in the Midwest affected, including Iowa, were affected by this mass expansion, but also by Black people who were actively arguing for their rights, arguing for their rights that they believed were theirs by birthright, as birthright citizens, right? These are exciting things that haven't been discussed enough, right, in Iowa history or Midwest history. There's tons of work being done right now to look at the experience of Black people and the things that they helped to change and transform in the Midwest. And the Civil War era is just one of those places in which I'm doing research and others are doing research to look at their contributions. You look at the 60th U.S. Colored Infantry, which was the first Iowa infantry of African descent, and what they did after the war. They come home after the war, and one of the first things they do before they even go home to see their families is they hold a colored convention in which they demand their rights as citizens. They demand the right to vote because of their service, right? And so as a result, Iowa was one of the first states, first northern states to allow Black men the right to vote, right? These are amazing stories and amazing transformations that come as a result of the work that Black people put in. not just gifts that white people are giving to them. So this story of white triumphalism, as was mentioned, this disrupts that, right? And also further work needs to be done, of course, on showing that once those rights were given legally, those had to be secured by Black people in their communities, and that's a whole nother story that had to take place. But yes, exciting work that's happening, and there's just so much. There's just so much more to learn, and yeah, and I think a big part of that, as we've many have been mentioning here, is just that the Midwest is diverse. It's not as diverse as many other parts of the country, but we have a very diverse history that has, in many ways, been whitewashed. And this is a period of revitalization and bringing those histories back to life.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about, I grew up in northwestern Iowa, far from the border, right, or the southern border. But as you're talking, Dwayne, it makes me realize that even a state like Iowa is diverse, to where the experience of people who lived on that border, especially if you have African Americans escaping slavery coming north, right, that wasn't the experience necessarily of those on the border with Minnesota, but it was a very palpable and real experience for many communities, especially throughout Iowa, but especially on that border, right? So anyway, a wonderful point. Yeah, mentioned from Sibley. I'm from Sanborn. So in the chat, sorry, Joellen will know where Sanborn is. Wonderful. We'll jump to the next question. I just, very, very generative kind of conversation here. I really appreciate it. So the next question I want to pose is, so what's missing, right? And some of you've hit on all of this, each of you have, but what's missing, and what isn't being studied that maybe you think folks should be studying, or are there reasons why that isn't happening, right? So this is the kind of like, where are the holes in Iowa history, probably Midwestern history too, but where are the holes? And we'll start with Dr. Howard for this question.
So there are a lot of holes. You know, I wrote a piece about this in Iowa Magazine last summer, that, you know, part of the university's kind of MO and part of the state and the regions is to tout the first and the best, right? Like, we have Elizabeth Catlett, right, the world-renowned sculptor, and came to University of Iowa, and Al Jarreau came to the University of Iowa, and like almost every book that I have loved this past year by Black authors, most of them have been affiliated with the Iowa's workshop. Awesome. But I'm interested in stories that are not the first and best. Where are the people who are hidden? Where are the stories of people who aren't in the archives, right? Those are the stories that I think can be so generative and really didactic in how we even understand what Black Iowa and Black Midwest is. Just, you know, as point of reference. So 55% of Black Iowans live in 4 places: Cedar Rapids, Waterloo, Des Moines, and Coralville, which is like adjacent to Iowa City, which is not a small percentage of people. But that means that almost 45% of them are living somewhere else. What is the Black experience in that somewhere else? What does that mean? And let's just, you know, not push Black people aside, actually, but just momentarily, right? We also know that there is a growing Latinx population in Iowa. 6%, right? This is a huge percentage, right? Black folks are about 4% of the Black Iowa, or of the Iowa population right now. So what does the Midwestern Latinx story look like? What does it look like for Asian Americans? What does it look like for First Nation and Indigenous people? What do those stories look like as individual accounts, as well as the interracial, right? Instead of always just breaking things down into a white-Black binary, what does it mean when communities are working with each other, and what do those tensions look like? So that's one thing I'm thinking about. And I think it's also important that we interrogate why we are leaving out the stories that we are leaving out. Why is it that we still have these gaps in the history? Is it because of there's lack of archives, right? I was so inspired by Dr. Courtney Pierre Joseph in the plenary, right? Saying that we have to build our archives. And we know for communities of colors, there's great skepticism to put our materials in archives because of the way they're mishandled, the way that they're forgotten. So thinking about that, thinking about what does it mean if you're working, you know, at a meat packing plant? Like, what are the archives that those people leave behind? And as you know, the scholar Marissa Fuentes says, reading, you know, along the bias grade, right? Reading the maybe extant primary and archival documents that we have in a new way. So what does it mean to read, like, you know, these democratic conventions that are trying to bar Black people from entry, right? It's not at the state level, but it's at the county level, and that they're trying to implement these kind of Black codes, right? And so Iowa can pat themselves on the back from not being a statewide initiative, but there are still counties that are doing this. And the fact that there are all white counties in Iowa is not accidental. Things don't just accidentally become all white. There have to be things in process and in place that render them such. So those are kind of some of the histories that I would love to see being told. And of course, as we move forward, as was also said in the plenary, we need to begin to challenge what it means to be Black in the Midwest, as it is increasingly an international population, one that did not come to Iowa through the Great Migration, but are coming with this third wave of migration from places in the Caribbean and from the continent of Africa.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, that's so generative. And it makes me think about, there was an article in the Annals last year where the author was looking at these diaries, but she found evidence of Latin American people in Storm Lake in the 1920s. And she also found evidence of African American people in Storm Lake. But if you looked at the census, there were none, right? But this lawyer was writing about them in ways that were really interesting, but you had to really dig to find their stories. Very interesting. It just really lines up, and I get little goosebumps thinking about like how hard the work is, but also that it's really there. So wonderful. Dr. Young, let's keep the conversation going.
Okay, thank you. You know, the one thing I could talk about, but I sort of wanted to keep the scope narrow. There have been some outstanding histories of native peoples in Iowa. What I'm really wanting to focus on here is interaction, Indian-white relations. I think that it's really critical, you know, to separate that out from, you know, Euro-American history and just Native history. How did two different cultural traditions come together? That's always been a fascination of mine. As I was putting this all together, I hadn't really thought much about it, but it really kind of, you know, became sort of glaring, particularly in the last month or so, as I was putting all this together. You know, there's been a lot written on the, you know, the French communities of Wisconsin, Green Bay and Prairie du Chien. And they were not purely French, they were Métis. They were people of mixed American Indian and French ancestry, something like 90% of the population. The Illinois country, which was basically coterminous with Southern Illinois, was the same thing. And there, of course, slavery, not just African-American slavery, but American Indian slavery. And probably the most powerful group of slave catchers, slave proprietors were the Illinois Indians themselves. They were probably, you know, it just gets very, you know, you start seeing all the, you know, recently, I think of Empire by Collaboration. There's been some great work on Prairie du Chien, but, you know, between Prairie du Chien and the Illinois country is Eastern Iowa. And like I said, you know, Eastern Iowa was largely devoid of any French settlements until 1796, when Julian Dubuque opens what he called the Spanish mines, because it was from the Spanish land grant. I was somewhat surprised to see that there's been almost nothing written on, you know, on Julian Dubuque and the Spanish mines recently. As a matter of fact, I'm half tempted to maybe once I get a few other things off my plate to start diving into that myself. It just seems like there's been almost nothing written since the 60s, and again, we have to keep in mind that paradigm, the native ground, how much did Julian Dubuque, how much say did he have in running the Spanish mines? Of course, he ran, the Meskwaki Indians were his partners. And I'm willing to bet if we dig deeper into the archival sources, we're going to see that the Meskwaki had as much or probably more say in the development of that as something of a locus of not just European settlement, but American Indian settlement. Now, again, I think before the Blackhawk War, there were probably only about 50 non-native people in Iowa. Again, that's one of the things that makes Iowa very different than states like Missouri and Illinois to the south. Those had large French populations. They were heavily intermarried, not only with American Indians, but with African Americans. The same was true at Prairie du Chien. You've got this sort of, this big space that didn't have any French settlements. It was completely native. The Iowa and the Dakota being the principal powers in the region. But as I said earlier, the Blackhawk War radically changes that whole situation in 1832. And that leads to the next point. The other sort of new paradigm, and I've heard a lot of people say it in this conference so far, settler colonialism. Now, settler colonialism, that really emerged on the scene intellectually probably about the same time as the native ground did. And settler colonialism is interesting. The native ground is largely a historical construct of the Midwest, the Mississippi Valley. Settler colonialism has really exploded on the scene, particularly in the last 10 years. And there are scholars who are looking at not just North America, but of course, Latin America, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa. So that's the second, major paradigm. And there are two really good books that came out recently, one by Bethel Saylor, one by John Rada, that looks at state formation. Bethel Saylor looks at state formation in Wisconsin. Once you've gotten, the United States brings a completely different ideology to its understanding of the Midwest and the native people who live there. They didn't see it as a native ground. They saw it as a place of future settlement, something that made the United States radically different from the French, the British, and the Spaniards who came before them. The United States initiates a policy of settler colonialism. It starts in the Ohio Valley in the 1790s. The Blackhawk War, as I say, it brings it on with a vengeance into Illinois, northern Wisconsin, or northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, and eastern Iowa. And then, of course, that informs the whole process of going from a territory to a state. It's sort of the governing ideology. So I would say that, those are some of the things that are missing. We need to look at, particularly, I think, the development of Dubuque within the lens of the native ground. We also need to look at state formation in Iowa from 1832 onward through the lens of settler colonialism. And again, there's just so many outstanding works that have come out in the last 10 years. I've just mentioned some of the major works that have come out. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's terrific. It's interesting, right, to think about how all these questions are kind of connecting with similar themes and ideas. I also want to, before I pass it on to Mr. Coleman, I want to highlight that I'm aware of our time, and so we'll hear from our last two panelists on this question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Raise your hand. I'll keep an eye out. But after Dr. Egge finishes her remarks in this round, we'll open it up to the group. But first, Mr. Coleman, on that question of what's missing, what's next. So.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that's missing, and historians have a lot of work to do is really what it comes down to, and I include myself in that. As I do research, there's more there are more and more topics that I come across that I just wish that someone had written on it, and I think to myself, well, I guess I better get to it, kind of thing, and or hope that others will as well too. And a couple of the things that I think about that are missing are some of these local stories. These as Ashley mentioned, they're before that there were no articles or anything else written on African Americans living in Burlington, Iowa, and that was unfortunate because what I came across was a very important and rich history about these people, and I'm sure that many other cities and communities have similar kinds of histories, and with that. I think I had to do a lot of searching. I had to do a lot of looking through various different archives in order to create my own archive about African Americans in Burlington, Iowa. And I hope that, of course, can be used for later researchers who can, do more work on Burlington, and of course, there's more to be done in these other cities as well too. And thinking about these archives and creating archives, I think digital projects are really important, this day and age, with not only just providing resources, but getting that information that we as historians are researching and spending so much time on out there to the public, right? To educate and share with the public these wonderful and amazing histories, diverse. And what we're doing is we're working to try to create our own archive about the color conventions and how Black people in Iowa participated in the color conventions and used the color conventions to argue for their own civil rights and to expand civil rights here in Iowa. And that was a movement that most people aren't even familiar with. We hope that through the project that we can help the public to learn more about this, but also to put those resources, Black people moving are newcomers to the region, right? Black migration has always been a part of Iowa history, always been a part of the Midwest history. And the kind of research, that we're doing is disrupting those narratives of the Midwest as being all white, and that Black people and other minorities don't have any place or history in that narrative. And so my hope, of course, is to share more on this and to help to show how diverse the Midwest history actually is, and to help those who have been marginalized to feel that they have a place and a history here.
Terrific, thank you. And there's a question in the chat for you, Dwayne. It might be easier if you just.
And here we're seeing similar work done. And so this is one of the things that is missing, LGBTQ history in Iowa. It needs a lot more work. And so I know people like having these kinds of archival materials is excellent, but building them is part of that process. So that's my first point. Okay, the second thing I want to do, I want to take on this question of Iowa as the middle land, because I think middleness is a problem, because it implies that there's some sort of blend between something and something. And I'm talking about this idea that Dorothy Schweeder brings up, where it's kind of, we're Eastern, we're Western, we're urban, we're rural. There's sort of this in-betweenness, and we're just this blend of everything. And then so analytically, the argument is that there's some sort of homogeneous quality to Iowa. And I think that is not at all true, that narrative, race or gender or class, et cetera. And so this is the narrative that I think is what's missing, is to really complexitize and put to bed this idea that Iowa and the Midwest are in the middle of something, and that something is some sort of homogeneous blend, when in fact, I think of this place as a space where all different people interact. As Dwayne said, there's constant mobility of different groups, whether it's Indigenous or Black or Latinx. And so that to me, I think is the history that at 175 years that where we are, that is really where we need to take this, is to recognize that the Middle West and the Midwest, whatever that is not just one vast singular thing, but lots of things, and contested, conflicted, continue to be retold, that story. And so that's, I think, where this is.
Have a question, you could raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask it. I have lots of thoughts, so we will not suffer. We will not sit in silence, but it's open to the group. Oh yeah, go ahead, Joellen, and then we'll go to Corey. I see Corey's hand. So Joellen first, and then Corey. Oh, you're on mute, Joellen.
Sorry, thought I did that. I just wanted to mention that sometimes for people looking for a place to start, events can be really, was the home of one of the first two meetings of the National American Women's Suffrage Association when they started meeting outside Washington, D.C. in 1895. I can't remember whether it was 1895 or 1897, but that's something that there would be some official write-ups in the history of America of a woman's suffrage, but I haven't seen very much about that particular event. And just looking at who was there nationally and throughout the state can lead in all kinds of different directions. And also in Grand Rapids, we've been doing a lot of pioneering work on women during World War I. And most people don't realize that after US entry in April 1917, because that can give all kinds of information about what people were doing. However, newspapers everywhere from mid 1917 through 1918, through the end of the war, the newspapers are just filled with activities about tanning clubs, just all kinds of things that women were doing. So that's kind of a broad look at an event, but looking within these counties, within the local newspapers across the state. The state chairs papers are in the Iowa Women's Archive. There's not a whole lot there, but there are lots of clues. So those can be some really good wedges for other reform movements that were going on during the era. And these things in World War I crossed racial, religious, class boundaries, we've been finding. Thanks.
Would anyone like to comment on that kind of idea of events and entry points? I also want to note in the chat, I'm just kind of doing next up question on deck, just so that as you're raising your hands, you know that I'm seeing you. So, but before we move on, any thoughts from the panel? I think it's a great, oh yeah, Ash.
Oh no, I think that's such a rich resource, and and to again think about institution building, and again thinking creatively of how we get at these people who history tends to forget about. And I think events are a particularly wonderful example of that, because it forces us to see people where they are actually organizing and meeting together. So that's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think about here at the Annals, a lot of times we get a great article that's about an event that helps us see a variety of different topics and themes much more richly, right? It's a great and very manageable entry point a lot of times. So really well taken point. So let's move on to Corey with your question, and then after that on deck I've got Richard, and I'm I knew I'm not gonna say your last name correctly.
Looking me to jump around between all these meetings, so it's blame her if I ask something already covered. But I would be curious about, particularly with some of these archives that we build out and build forward too, right? That Joellen mentioned, Iowa Women's Archives as a fantastic resource for Iowa history into even the 70s, 80s, 90s, and today, playing the hits all the way through. Wondering in terms of how you use those archives then to reach communities within Iowa, particularly thinking about rural communities as well, and getting to this idea of challenging, like Sarah talked about, this kind of this conformity and this kind of middleness of Iowa. But convincing stakeholders on, within both kind of urban and rural communities across a rather chilling political climate in Iowa too right now, how do you convince people to take part in these projects and to be kind of within these conversations that Iowa history is facilitating? Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I will allow our panelists to jump in as they wish.
Well, I'll just say quickly, I second what Dwayne said about the digital history products, exhibits. I think it was you, Dwayne. Sorry if I'm misremembering. But I think that's something that's really important. The Iowa Women's Archives actually is a really great digital or online scrapbook for the women's suffrage movement. So that's one place where I have found, if I have interested local community members in women's suffrage, I will often say, you should check this out. If you can't, especially during COVID, if you can't go there, they have these options. So that's one way to do it. But you're absolutely right. Like, it's great for us to talk about this, but actually getting the broader conversation and flourishing in that way, it can be challenging. And so I think that's one way to start.
Yeah, and I would add, definitely the Women's Archive has some great resources there. And one of them I'm thinking of is there's a digital project called Migration is Beautiful. And that's a wonderful digital project that discusses Latinx people in Iowa and their experiences in Iowa. Lots of photos and images and things like that. And so I think too, I've had an opportunity a couple of different times, especially since the last summer and the the upheaval that we've been seeing all over the country about policing and racial justice movement. And so I think that there are more of those opportunities around to be able to discuss these kinds of things. And it just shows how important the research that all of us are doing is. While I may focus and discuss a lot, or research a lot on African Americans into the 1900s, the kinds of issues that many African Americans were facing during that time period are some of the same issues that we're seeing today. And so we can learn from that and hopefully not repeat many of the same things that we're continually repeating over and over.
Wonderful. I think Dwayne is finished. You're okay. Sorry. I would also just briefly, Corey also mentioned that the State Historical Society is a great part of our mandate is to reach out to all Iowans, regardless of where they live. And so a lot of our programming does reach out. We have a mobile museum that goes out throughout the state. We have programming that's designed to go to rural spaces. So a lot of times if historians make connections with us, we have connections or interests in places, and we can help to get that information out and help facilitate that. And we also want to be a part of it. So I know that's something we talk about a lot here, is how we're serving all Iowans. I also think maps are a great idea. So to Patrick's point about maps, like how meaningful would it be for my parents who live in Northwest Iowa to see that area mapped as Dakota land, not Iowa, right? Maps are really accessible. So, but I think our last question will probably be our last question, and I will hand it over to Richard.
Hi, I was just gonna mention the Iowa Women's Archives and the State Historical Society, both in Des Moines and Iowa City, because people don't necessarily know that those are two different, collections, although they move material between the two. Yeah, I mean, I heard some really interesting things. I am wondering about where some of these projects intersect. Work on Latinas more specifically, or African American women more specifically, or Indigenous women more specifically, and so I'm hearing about gender and suffrage, which in Iowa wasn't exclusively white, but is often presented as such, right? And then the presentation on these other communities, but there's so much intersection there that I think that we need to continue to look at and to uncover and things like that. So it was just shout out to the Women's Archives, especially Kathy Neal did some wonderful work with Karen Mason back in the late 90s with collecting Black women's stories, Latina stories. And so that is, those are collections and archives not to be missed. So, but thank you. Thank you, panelists.
I mean, I think there are some really exciting kind of, crossovers. There was the Imagining Latinidades working project, which was a 3-year funded program through, I believe, the Mellon Foundation, which was sponsored panels and, fellowships and all of these types of things, specifically looking at Latinx experience within the Midwest. And there was specifically a working class and gendered perspective on that. And I know because of Leslie Schwalm's interest, the Colored Conventions Project very much is mindful about gendered dimensions of that as well. But I agree. I think that is someplace that work needs to be more filled. And we know this is a problem of, social hierarchies, right? The more social hierarchies you find yourself on the bottom of, the more difficult it is to be found in the archive, which makes our jobs all the more difficult. I just also want to note that I dropped into the chat the Migration is Beautiful link. And then another of our colleagues at the University of Iowa, Colin Gordon, is doing a project on mapping inequality redlining in Iowa, which is kind of another kind of tie-in about how we find these histories and how we get more robust actual histories to the way that Dr. Bro was talking about, is integrating our students to do firsthand research. It opens their eyes, it helps them become better scholars, and we can get at these projects in new ways than the ways that us paid folk often think about, because they're brilliant and have great new ideas as well. So those are just the 2 things I dropped in the chat.
Yeah, I don't know, Sarah, if you want to jump in at all on these questions too, since we're talking about gender, but I just wanted to just to say thank you for that question. And I know one of my favorite parts about my job here at the Annals is I get to see up and coming scholarship. And I know that there are scholars working right now on the exact intersections that you mentioned, Dr. Bro, like this about women and racial identity and communities. And so there is more to come. Scholarship is a slow process, but I am excited to say that I know some people who are doing some really fascinating work. And a lot of this work and some more will also be featured in a special issue of the Annals that's going to be coming together this fall. So we'll have that to kind of keep pushing the conversation forward. We have 23 seconds. So if anyone wants an absolute last word, but just thank you so much. This has been beyond delightful.